Now, let me say one more thing before we move on, before we turn to the husbands. What is submission not according to this text? When I preached on this probably 20 years ago, I found the women in my church found this really helpful because we bring to the text presuppositions from our experience, like, okay, submission means this, 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 and this, and 5 of those look horrible to you, and 2 look okay. And if you bring to the Bible your preconceptions, you might just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, if that's what it means, I'm out of here, which would be very, very sad. You may be right, you may be wrong, but it would be sad. So here, I wrote 6 of them down, and I think you'll be able to see them in the text. What submission is not? Number 1, submission is not agreeing on everything like the Christian faith, because this guy's an unbeliever. So if in that culture he said, you can't have that religion, we worship ISIS or we worship whatever, she says, I'm sorry. Which means it is possible to be submissive and refuse to think what your husband says you should think. Has to be. I mean, this text doesn't make sense without that. She has sworn allegiance to Jesus. Jesus is now her Lord, her King. She's an alien and an exile in this marriage. This husband belongs to another God, and she is called to live with him. Don't get divorced over issues of religion. Which means if he says, I don't want you to be a Christian, what does she say? She says, I love you. I want to be submissive to you. I intend to be submissive to you. But on this point, I have no choice. I belong to Jesus. And he may send her away. That happened in 1 Corinthians 7. The unbeliever splits, which would be a great tragedy. So, submission does not mean you must agree with the opinions of your husbands, even on things like the Christian faith. God has made you with a mind. You have to think. You are a person, not a body and not a respondent mechanism here. You're a thinking being who is able to process whether the gospel is true. And if it's true, you believe it. And if he says you can't believe that, you humbly and submissively don't submit to that. You see that? That's implied here clearly. Number 2, submission does not mean leaving the brain at the altar. Now maybe that's the same thing, but it needs to be said that way. Leaving the brain at the altar. Any man who says, I do the thinking in this family, is sick. And there are sick views of authority. I dealt with a couple one time, and she said, he demands that I get permission to go to the bathroom. That's real. And I just looked at him and I said, you're not well. You have such an unbelievably distorted view of this fellow heir of the grace of life. You don't get Bible texts. You're taking a word like authority or lead or her word submit, and then you're stepping away from the Bible and filling up with stuff you want to do. You're not getting this from the Bible. So when I say submission does not leave the brain at the altar, I mean all through the marriage, he is reckoning with an independent mental center that has thoughts that are worth listening to. The one flesh union, leadership does not mean don't listen. Leadership doesn't even mean always get the last word. Leadership often says, you were right, I was wrong. Leadership is taking initiative. Sometimes I say, who says let's more often in your relationship? Let's go out to eat. Let's try to get our finances in order. Let's get to church on time next Sunday. 100 let's. Who says it most often? If it's the wife, got a problem. And the problem is with the guy. If it's the guy, she's probably happy because she's tired of having to say let's over and over again. Can we let's get the car fixed, please? I said that last week. Let's get to church on time and you're always late. Let's. Wives don't want to say let's most often in general. I know I'm generalizing. Leadership means a bent towards initiative that women thrive under. Not dictation, not never listening, not even having the last word. My wife, if she were here and you ask her, so what does submission look like for you guys? One of the things she'd say is, okay, we settled the principle early that if we can't agree, Johnny's gonna make the call. That's real basic. Almost never happens, right? Almost never happens. One of the reasons it almost never happens, we've been together a long time, we know what each other thinks, but it's because I yield. Often. I yield. I don't have to have the last word. Like we're putting in a counter in the basement, and I thought 72 inches would be right. I think that's too long. I think that creates a space that's too small there. I said, yeah, but it's more space on top for putting out the dishes and stuff, and back and forth. I called her yesterday and said, just call it. Do it. Little things like that, hundreds of them, right? You don't. Number 3, submission does not mean avoiding the effort to influence or change the husband. Avoiding the effort to influence or change the husband. The whole point of the text is win him. Win him. Her life is devoted to changing this husband from an unbeliever to a believer. I mean, can you imagine if somebody said submission means stop trying to change your husband? Well, I get what they might be saying. I mean, I already said, if you've tried 20 years to change each other, put it in the compost pile. But if your husband is living in sin, or your wife is living in sin or unbelief, you want them to change, and you wouldn't be a loving person if you didn't. And that may sound insubordinate to some. It's not, biblically. Number 4, submission is not putting the will of the husband before the will of Christ. Submission is not putting the will of the husband before the will of Christ. Christ is her Lord now, and for the Lord's sake, she will submit to the husband. But he's not her Lord. And so wherever the two have to be chosen between, she chooses Jesus. If he says, let's get involved in a scam, let's have group sex, her choice is clear. I go with Jesus on this. And she would say it not with a haughty, arrogant, but rather with a longing. He will be able to discern in her a longing that he not do that so that she could enjoy him as her leader. You feel that? I will not follow your lead on this, and I'm not following it with a demeanor that makes you know I want to follow your leadership. And I can't in this moment, this way. Number 5, submission does not mean getting all her spiritual strength through her husband. Submission does not mean getting all of her spiritual strength through her husband. He's not giving her any spiritual strength in this text. And she's got lots of it. Her hope is in God. She's probably going to church on Lord's Day morning before he gets up. Getting her strength elsewhere. Getting her worldview elsewhere. And number 6, submission does not mean acting in fear. She's fearless. So, I love the scriptures. I'm a complementarian. I believe that men are called to a unique kind of leadership in marriage. I believe that women are called to a unique kind of submission in marriage, and I think it's a beautiful thing. And I think if we probe the depths and keep digging into the scriptures, even though they're written in another time, they will shape a marriage into a beautiful thing. So I would define submission like this. Submission is the divine calling of a wife to honor and affirm her husband's leadership, and so to help carry it through according to her gifts.